Between the 1970s and 80s, the unveiling of numerous child trafficking rings took place. Unfortunately, there were also many children who died at the hands of serial killers during this time, including killers whose names are still remembered to this day. What is not commonly discussed is the possibility of an interconnection between these serial killings and the large networks of child trafficking that occurred within the same time period. In 2011, at the age of 83, a man named John David Norman died while in state custody. Although not much is known about Norman's childhood and teenage years, he spent much of his later life in and out of prison for multiple offenses as a sexually violent predator and pedophile. Throughout his life, he used a number of different aliases, including John Paul Norman, Steve Corll, Alan Hitchcock, and several others. Many of Norman's crimes involved the distribution of child pornography and sex trafficking. However, Norman's access to a wide network of both clientele and children, as well as his alleged ties to serial killers Dean Corll and John Wayne Gacy, positioned Norman as the centerpiece of a greater conspiracy. Norman was arrested twice in Houston in 1954 and 1956 for sexual assault, but it's unknown if he was convicted at the time. The first official records of Norman's convicted sex crimes began in 1960, when Norman was convicted of sexual assault in California in 1963. A few years later, in 1970, Norman was convicted in federal court for sending obscene literature through the mail. He received a 15-month prison sentence for the federal charge. After serving a sentence, records indicate that this was only the beginning of his mission to establish a nationwide network of homosexual prostitution and pedophilia. In the early 1970s, an organization called the Odyssey Foundation was grooming teenage boys and young men to be trafficked to clients across the country. The organization referred to these boys as fellows and photographed them for booklets that were advertised to, quote, sponsors, who would then choose and pay for their company. The fellows were trafficked across the country to meet and stay with the sponsors for 1 to 3 days on average, before traveling to the next sponsor. At some point, a man in San Francisco tipped authorities about the organization. On August 13th, 1973, it was John David Norman's apartment at 3716 Corll Avenue that Dallas police raided based on this tip. During the raid, police seized booklets bearing the name International, which contained photographs and contact information of the teenage boys and young men, or the fellows. Police also seized 30,000 index cards listing between 50,000 and 100,000 clients located in 35 US states. The amount of confiscated material was enough to fill a pickup truck. As profound as this discovery was, what makes it even more astonishing is the fact that following the transfer of the index cards to the government, they were ultimately destroyed by the State Department. Some consider this to be a significant cover-up. In May 1977, Dallas Police Lieutenant Harold Hancock told the Chicago Tribune that prominent public figures and federal employees were among the names found in Norman's client list. State Department Counselor Matthew Nemetz confirmed that the department indeed received the cards and destroyed them after determining them to be, quote, not relevant to any fraud case concerning a passport. In the end, Norman was charged with possession of marijuana, conspiracy to commit sodomy, and contributing to the delinquency of a juvenile. He was released on bail, after which he fled to Homewood, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago, in late 1973, and began using the name Steve Corll. It was around this time in 1973 that news reports indicated that police were investigating possible ties between Norman and a serial killer named Dean Corll. Corll's family had previously owned a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he had been known to give free candy to local children, which earned him the nicknames the Candyman and the Pied Piper. During his activity between 1970 and 1973, it is said that Corll murdered a minimum of 28 teenage boys and young men between the ages of 13 and 20 in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. These crimes became widely known as the Houston Mass Murderers, with the victims collectively given the group name the Lost Boys. Dean Corll did not work alone. In 1967, Corll befriended a boy named David Owen Brooks, who was 12 years old at the time. Brooks initially became part of a small crowd of youths that spent time at Corll's candy factory, and even joined Corll on regular trips he took to South Texas beaches. Brooks claimed that Corll was the first adult male who did not mock his appearance. Whenever Brooks told Corll he needed cash, Corll gave him money. But over time, Corll's urges led him to gradually groom Brooks into developing a sexual relationship where Corll would pay him with cash or gifts in exchange for pleasure. In December 1970, Brooks entered Corll's apartment unannounced. Corll was sexually assaulting 2 teenage boys who were strapped to a 4-poster bed. Brooks was promised a car in return for his silence, and he accepted. Corll later purchased a green Chevrolet Corvette for Brooks and admitted to murdering 2 boys. He then offered Brooks $200 for any boy he could lure to Corll's apartment. Brooks accepted his offer and officially became his accomplice. In high school, a boy named Elmer Wayne Henley had become friends with David Brooks. The two often played together, and Henley eventually became aware that Brooks spent a lot of his free time with an older man. By the winter of 1971, Brooks had lured at least 6 teenage boys to Corll's various addresses, although Henley had no knowledge of Brooks' activities with Dean Corll. It was around this time that Brooks decided to introduce Henley to Corll, no doubt intending for Henley to become Corll's next victim. However, it seems that Corll saw potential in Henley. Instead of killing him, they began spending time together. It's quite possible that, by this time, Henley may have already connected the dots. He had noticed the pattern of disappearances that were occurring in his hometown. Corll told Henley that he belonged to an organization based in Dallas which recruited young boys for a child sex slavery ring, and offered Henley the same fee as Brooks, $200 for any boy that he could lure to Corll's apartment. On August 8, 1973, Henley brought a potential victim named Timothy Curley to Corll's home, claiming that they were going to a party. Before Corll was able to confine Curley, the pair left Corll's home to buy some sandwiches. Upon returning, Corll noticed that they had brought with them a 15-year-old girl named Rhonda Williams. Corll was furious and told Henley in private that he had, quote, ruined everything. However, Corll waited before acting. Once the teenagers had fallen asleep from a night of drinking and smoking, he bound and gagged all of them. Henley pleaded for his life and promised to participate in the torture and killing if Corll released him. Corll agreed and untied Henley. Behind Corll's back, Henley took the pistol and ordered Corll to stop. However, Corll did not listen, and Henley ended up shooting him 6 times, killing him. 2 years after these events, police investigations would reveal pictures depicting 11 of Corll's victims during a raid on a child prostitution ring. This, among other details, led to the possibility of a connection between John Norman's Odyssey Foundation and Dean Corll's killings. Mere months after the Corll case became news, Norman left Texas. Was the publicity a contributing factor to Norman's decision to move? Corll also had many addresses, money to buy Brooks a car, and money to pay the boys for each victim. This indicated the possibility of an additional income source outside of his job as an electrician. Was he taking pictures of the boys before murdering them and selling the pictures to the Odyssey Foundation as CP? These are questions that remained unanswered, but even so, the possibility of a link between these two cannot be discarded. Returning to John Norman's activities, it was mentioned that after his release in Dallas, Norman fled to Homewood, Illinois, and went by the name Steve Gurwell. On November 14th, 1973, Norman was arrested and charged with 5 counts of indecent liberties with a child and 8 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor. In less than 3 months, Norman had sexually abused 10 teenage boys. 3 years later, in the spring of 1976, Norman was bailed out of Cook County Jail for $36,000 by an unknown person in California. He was still awaiting trial on charges for his crimes in Homewood. In December of the same year, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison and sent to Pontiac Correctional Center. However, before he was released on bail from Cook County Jail, he had already started his next mission. Using the jail's printing press, he published a newsletter called Hermes. This newsletter was for a new plan, which he called the Delta Project. According to Norman, the Delta Project aimed to, quote, provide educational, travel, and self-development opportunities for qualified young men of character and integrity. The newsletter claimed that Delta dorms were being established across the US, with each dorm having 2 to 4 cadets, overseen by a Don. Though it was alleged that the cadets were underage male prostitutes recruited in Chicago, Norman denied that Project Delta was sexual in nature. Police later investigated and determined that the newsletter had 5,000 subscribers and grossed over $300,000 per year. Norman was paroled in 1977, but less than a year later, in June 1978, he was arrested again in Chicago for having sex with 2 underage boys from a local foster home and taking pornographic pictures of both. One of the boys told investigators that they were going to be sold to a Canadian Don, and that Norman had been waiting for plane tickets. Following the raid on Norman's apartment, police found cameras, pornographic material, and tens of thousands of pink index cards with the names of customers and their sexual preferences. The index cards contain names from every state and some foreign countries, with some cards containing pictures of the customers. Norman had been accused of refounding the Delta Project, the crime for which he had already been sentenced for 4 years, except this time, he had given the operation a new name: the Creative Corps and MC Publications. He was charged with 2 counts of contributing to the delinquency of a minor and violation of his probation. A few years later, from his rural home and a nearby motel in Pennsylvania, Norman produced and released yet another publication of CP, a magazine called Handy Andy. He exploited at least 20 teenage boys from the area, enticing them with drugs and alcohol, and taking pictures of them engaged in various sex acts. Norman fled from Pennsylvania after his home was raided again, but was eventually captured in Bolingbrook, Illinois in October 1984. In 1985, he was released on bail, and he quickly fled once again. This process of being arrested and released and repeating his crimes continued throughout the years until 1999, when he was declared a sexually violent predator and was detained indefinitely at a Tuscadero State Hospital. He was eventually released from a Tuscadero to the rural town of Boulevard, California, under strict conditions. However, on February 2nd, 2009, Norman violated these conditions. As a result of these offenses, in March 2009, Norman was ordered back into state custody at Coalinga State Hospital, where he died 2 years later. Shockingly, Norman was never convicted for sex trafficking. Around the same time that Norman had been active, there was another serial killer going rampant in Chicago, and you may have heard of this one. He was known as the Killer Clown, due to his routine of dressing up as a clown prior to becoming a serial killer. He went by the name John Wayne Gacy, and there are numerous hints of possible connections between Gacy and Norman's Delta Project. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy had raped, tortured, and murdered at least 33 teenage boys and young men in Norwood Park Township near Chicago, Illinois. All of his murders were committed inside his ranch-style house. His killing methods were not original. Typically, he would lure a victim to his home and trick them into donning handcuffs on the pretext of demonstrating a magic trick. He later told police that he got the idea for his torture board from Elmer Wayne Henley, the same Elmer Wayne Henley who was Dean Corll's accomplice. Gacy owned a construction company called PDM Contractors. Much of PDM Contractors' workforce consisted of high school students and young men, and it was claimed that Gacy's victims would often be lured under the premise of a job at PDM. This company establishes a clear link between Gacy and Norman's Delta Project through one man named Philip Paskey. Paskey was described as blonde, tall, skinny, with pock marks on his face, and often dressed as a woman. He was also a known accomplice of John Norman during his time running the Delta Project. This connection became apparent when it was discovered that the two shared a P.O. box that was used for the distribution of Norman's newsletters. It also turns out that at one point in time, Philip Paskey also worked for Gacy's construction company, as evidenced by several pieces of paperwork, including payment receipts made from the company to Paskey. Aside from the paperwork, Gacy was once recorded in prison having a conversation, where he vents his frustration about being the only one to be convicted of the crimes. In the conversation, Gacy mentions 3 other names: Cram and Rossi, 2 other employees from PDM Contractors, as well as Paskey.
Those are all the people that keys to the house and shit. Well, aside from the 12 keys, we already know that Rossi, Cram, Paskey, and Norman were involved in the case. And you know something, what's funny? These son of a bitches know it too. And what does Cozen's Act do?
Gacy claimed that all of them had keys to his house.
David Cram, Rossi, and Paskey all had keys to the house. In fact, they used the house when I wasn't in town. And none of them got locked up. Nope, they're still free. Unbelievable.
Doesn't this sound familiar? I mean, a shared house with a number of youths, or cadets, supervised by a Don? Is it possible that Gacy's house was actually one of the Delta dorms that had been advertised in Norman's newsletters? At least 2 victims believed to have been murdered by Gacy had last been seen alive close to where Norman lived, leading to further speculation of a possible connection between Norman's Delta Project and Gacy's killings. In a 1992 interview, Gacy claimed that Norman and the Delta Project were producing snuff films of young boys, possibly including some of Gacy's victims. Had some of Dean Corll's victims also been filmed and sent to the Delta Project? And was the Delta Project paying for these films and distributing them around the country? A lot remains unknown, but Gacy's testimony surely raises a number of questions on the matter. Gacy remained adamant that someone else had performed killings in his house. Given his connection to Paskey, it's hard to ignore these claims, since Paskey is also a known killer. Ultimately, Gacy was convicted for 33 murders. At the time, this was the largest number of homicides by a single individual in the United States legal history. On March 13, 1980, Gacy was sentenced to death. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, a number of serial killers were active in the Chicago area. At the same time, the Delta Project, a nationwide child sex trafficking ring, was exposed through numerous raids on John D. Norman's various apartments over the years. We have explored the possible connections between Norman's Delta Project and other serial killers, such as Dean Corll, John Wayne Gacy, and Philip Paskey. With regard to Gacy in particular, he may have provided means of procuring victims and clients for the Delta Project, as well as providing a killing site, and even offering disposal services. Norman may have provided a larger network of clientele throughout the country for not only trafficking of boys and young men, but also the sort of content being produced by these killers. Some may even go so far as to consider the possibility of this network having evolved into the modern conspiracies revolving around missing children and predatory practices that continue even to this day. Was the Delta Project the precursor to it all? We can only wonder.